Hello. It is time for Wednesday's Q&A. I'm Jillian Murphy of the Food Freedom Body Love Method, and on Wednesdays usually, I try to answer a question from you about intuitive eating, body image, weight, health, diet culture, any of the above. So this week, here's the question. Jill, how do you balance eating intuitively while dealing with digestive health issues or healing the gut? Protocols around healing digestion can be really restrictive. However, eating certain foods such as grains and dairy can cause discomfort and further impact gut health for many folks. So this is from Courtney, who I know is a holistic nutritionist or is in holistic nutrition school. So I know that, I'm going to gear my answer a little bit towards that, but I think this is a question that gets asked a lot. So I think, it'll apply to many people, whether you're in a health field or not. Okay. So first of all, yes, food affects our health. I never deny that, right? Like food definitely affects the way that we feel. And so there are times when our bodies feel physically unwell, and we have to recognize that something needs to change, right? Like that is actually our body speaking to us. That is part of intuitive eating. Intuitive eating involves listening to your body and what your body is saying. And our body typically starts with subtle whispers or bits of information. And when we don't hear it or we don't listen, that information gets stronger and louder. And it can start to manifest as a physical illness when we haven't been listening. And so part of intuitive eating, it's actually part of the process to check in with our physical body. And when our physical body is not feeling well, to start to take notice if there are foods that are making us feel unwell. And if we aren't sure, it can be a really interesting exploratory process to play around with the foods that we're putting in our body and see if they are or are not affecting us positively or negatively. And I think that that's a totally reasonable thing to do, right? Food affects our health. When our health isn't feeling well, we listen. And we can either intuitively tell that there are foods that aren't feeling good in our body based on how our body responds, or we can seek some outside help to give us some direction. Totally a valid thing to do. What I will say though is that when people are eliminating food for health's purpose, for health's sake, physical health's sake, there is generally very little drama around the choices that the people are making. So they come into the office and they ask for advice. And when I was a general naturopath, I would give advice, and they would go home and they would play around with it, and they would be able to come back and report if they were feeling better or not. And, they might feel like it was annoying or frustrating to have to cut out gluten or dairy, but there just wasn't a whole lot of drama, and they would cut it out, and if they felt better, great. And occasionally if they decided to eat it anyway and they ended up with like a digestive complaint like diarrhea or gas or bloating, it would be like, again, well, that's annoying, but I made the choice or I made the mistake, no big deal, whatever. Very like drama free, as with other health choices, when we have to make them that don't involve food, right? It's like, sometimes the choices we have to make are annoying. Like sometimes we can't drink red wine because it gives us a headache. It's just annoying and frustrating. And we just make the adult decision to not have it and not do it. What I will say though, is that when people are getting really dramatic, when there's reactivity and compulsiveness around the decision, so like, I need to cut out gluten, it's so bad for me, but I just keep like binge eating it, or I can avoid it all day and then I binge eat it at night or on the weekend. Anytime there is reactivity or compulsivity around a food, it's an indication that the main motivator for cutting that food out is not actually health, it's weight. And so, when or if I had a patient in my office that was having that compulsivity and that reactivity around food, I would always know that their motivation was off in terms of like Are they really here to fix their physical health? Or are they just looking for confirmation that they can cut these foods out and it's like socially acceptable while they're really just trying to lose weight, right? And so it's really important, you know, the distinction there is motivation. And if the patient or client or you as a human is having difficulty differentiating between what the motivation is, reactivity and compulsivity will always give you a really key insight into what the motivation is. Second thing I will say is that occasionally you as someone watching this who's just interested in this information, or for a holistic nutritionist or naturopath or medical doctor or whatever, you know, occasionally physical health isn't actually the most important thing. So sometimes if you have someone in front of you or you are the person and there's a digestive complaint, like I'm having a lot of bloating or I'm having a lot of gas or like my stool is a bit loose or whatever it happens to be, but there's a bigger mental emotional issue. So there's been a lot of food issues. There's healing required when it comes to food. Sometimes it's more important to heal the mental emotional stuff than it is to heal the physical stuff, right? It's like sometimes we are working harder on our physical health and sometimes we need to work harder on our mental emotional health. And it's really important, I think, to consider that, because in the wellness world, we've gotten very, very, very obsessed with like all like physical wellness needs to be 100%. You know, like you can never, you know, if you ever have a headache, your health is totally off. Or if you have bloating at all, your health is totally off. And it's like, it's important to remember that physical health is a spectrum. It's not all or nothing. And that it's not the worst thing in the world if you have some bloating or a little bit of loose stool or whatever, if you are working at healing your mental emotional health, right? And so before working on your digestion and engaging in a really restrictive diet, I would encourage practitioners and patients to really think about what really requires healing the most, what requires the most attention. And sometimes you can give attention to all three, physical, mental, emotional, all at once, and that's cool. But you know, especially for women who've been engaged in that diet cycle for a long time, you know, they've basically been sacrificing everything to try to change their physical body, right? And so the recovery from that sometimes requires that we spend more time attending to the mental, emotional health. And then sometimes our physical health is a little bit messy while we do that. Like women tend to panic when they go through the process of legalizing food and normalizing their relationship with food because their digestive system gets a bit off. It's like, no big deal. It's just the mess of relearning how to eat. And it will resolve when this other stuff heals up and you're able to make better choices overall across the board with ease and peace and comfort, right? And then the third thing I will say is that when it comes to having something like a digestive issue, again, I think in our current wellness culture, we put so much emphasis on food. And again, it's not that I disagree that food affects our digestive system. Of course it does. Food and exercise and all of these things do affect our overall health. But I think that, you know, if you were to present the digestive issue, for example, to a holistic nutritionist and an acupuncturist and a naturopath and a psychotherapist and a medical doctor, like a general family practitioner and a GI specialist, you know, all 5 or 6 of those professions that I just named would probably have a very different treatment protocol for that digestive issue. And it would all undoubtedly be related to the tools that they are educated in, right? And so when someone comes to a naturopath or a holistic nutritionist with a digestive issue, we're so quick to assume that they need to cut out all these foods, and we forget about all of the other possibilities that are not what we're specially trained in, right? And so I encourage practitioners to remember that your toolkit's not the only toolkit. And when it comes to something like digestion specifically, there are lots of factors that play into how we digest food that has nothing to do with the actual food groups or quality of the food that we eat. Like that's a piece of the puzzle. But cephalic phase digestive response, CPDR, accounts for up to 60 to 70% of how we digest and break down food. And that's all in our heads. The stories we're telling, the beliefs we have, our stress levels. Are we taking the time to sit and chew and eat? And so if someone is not in a position to get on board with a really restrictive diet, there's a lot of stuff we can do that doesn't involve heavy restriction. And as someone who practiced general naturopathic medicine for over 10 years, I will say that I personally, in all of that time, never saw a patient get better from being on a really restrictive diet long term. Occasionally in the beginning, like sometimes our bodies require different phases, and sometimes our bodies require a little bit of rest. And so sometimes in the short term, I found that patients really benefited from cutting out a lot of foods, but long term it never worked. And the longer people practice, like when I speak to colleagues of mine who are naturopaths, yes, they're still concerned about food. Yes, they still talk to patients about food and make sure they're educated, but it's not their main focus because A, they realize that restrictive diets don't tend to work long term because people won't stay on them. First of all, even if they were totally effective. And second, because they don't tend to be any more effective than making minor nutritional shifts and supporting people with supplements and a more holistic perspective of health. And B, because health, food is part of health, but there's so much more that goes into our physical well-being than, again, just the foods we put in, right? Our stress levels, our awareness, our consciousness. There's just so many places we can work, right? So, Courtney, I hope that answers your question. If anyone else has any more questions about eating intuitively while dealing with health issues, super happy to answer. Have a great week. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll talk to you soon. Again, Jillian Murphy from the Food Freedom Body Love Method.